If you've ever felt like modern life gives you every tool to define yourself, yet somehow makes you feel more uncertain, more fragmented, more lost, you're not imagining it. Many people today are quietly asking, what if the way we think about identity, purpose, even selfhood, is part of the problem? In Western culture, the self is often treated like a project, something to build, brand, express, and defend. That approach has produced innovation, autonomy, and individual rights, but it's also led to new forms of pressure, isolation, and inner disorientation. Meanwhile, Eastern philosophical traditions, like Taoism, Buddhism, and Vedanta, have explored the self in very different terms, not as something to strengthen, but something to understand, dissolve, or transcend. This video explores 5 core ideas from those traditions, ideas that have often been simplified or misinterpreted in the West. The goal here isn't to idealize the East or critique the West. It's to explore how different assumptions about selfhood shape how we suffer and how we might find clarity. In recent decades, there has been a noticeable rise in interest toward Eastern philosophical systems, particularly Buddhism, Taoism, Advaita Vedanta, and related mystic traditions. But along with this rise has come something more difficult to detect, a subtle distortion. In many Western interpretations, these traditions are consumed not as complete systems of transformation, but as tools, often in service of goals that the philosophies themselves were meant to question or dissolve. Eastern thought is increasingly adopted through the lens of personal optimization. Its concepts are bent to serve the ego, not transcend it. Practices like meditation, mindfulness, or detachment are pursued not to empty the self, but to fortify it with new language, new rituals, new layers of self-image. But here's the philosophical problem. These systems were never intended to improve the ego. They were designed to disidentify from it entirely. This fundamental misalignment creates a paradox. The more the ego consumes these ideas, the more sophisticated its self-deception becomes. The teachings meant to dissolve illusion are instead used to reinforce it. The ego in Western thought is often equated with identity, agency, and freedom. But in most Eastern traditions, the ego is precisely what limits those things. It is the filter that reshapes reality to match its preferences. It's not just a psychological pattern, it's a metaphysical distortion. And when we import Eastern concepts into a framework that sees ego as sacred or untouchable, those ideas lose their teeth. They become aesthetic, at best inspirational, but no longer transformative. This isn't just a personal issue. It has civilizational consequences. Many of the modern world's crises, ecological collapse, political tribalism, overconsumption, moral detachment, can be traced back, not to ignorance, but to hyper-intelligent egos left unchecked. The ego, designed to survive, is now optimized to dominate, extract, and justify itself endlessly. And when Eastern teachings are misunderstood, they can inadvertently strengthen this trend. Used as spiritual decoration or self-justifying ideology, they risk becoming philosophical steroids for the very structures they were meant to dissolve. This video is not about rejecting Eastern ideas or Western ones. It's about recognizing the disconnect between traditions built to disrupt egoic identity and cultures trained to protect it at all costs. Each of the 5 concepts we're about to explore has the potential to bring clarity, space, and even peace to those caught in cycles of mental friction and existential fatigue, but only if we approach them in their proper context. The point is not to add them to our list of mental assets, but to reconsider the kind of self we think needs healing in the first place. Let's begin by exploring the first idea, non-duality, a concept often marketed as oneness or harmony. But in its original context, it offers something far more radical. In recent decades, the term non-duality has become popular in Western discourse, appearing in self-help books, meditation circles, mindfulness apps, and even therapy sessions. It's often described as the idea that everything is one, or that the boundaries between self and world are artificial. But this popular framing conceals more than it reveals. In its original context, particularly within Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism, non-duality is not a warm feeling of cosmic unity. It is a philosophical dismantling of the assumption that self and other are fundamentally separate. To say non-dual is not to affirm one, it is to deny two. It doesn't say everything is the same. It says the distinctions we perceive are not as real as we believe. You appear to be a self observing a world out there. But this apparent division, according to non-dual traditions, is a product of language, conditioning, and perception, not reality itself. The Western misunderstanding of this concept often begins at the level of translation. Western thought is deeply rooted in dualistic metaphysics: mind versus body, self versus other, subject versus object. These distinctions form the foundation of everything from ethics to science to personal identity. So when a concept like non-duality enters Western discourse, the impulse is to make it fit into existing structures. It's repackaged as oneness, unity, or interconnectedness, terms that feel comforting, even empowering. But non-duality is not comforting. It doesn't reinforce the self. It questions the validity of the self entirely. And when this idea is stripped of its original rigor, something subtle but serious happens. The ego, a pattern of thought and perception centered around me, begins to co-opt the concept that was meant to dissolve it. We end up with statements like, "I am one with everything." But who is the I that is one? My ego has awakened. But can an ego truly awaken, or only rebrand itself in more spiritual terms? This is not just a semantic issue. It has real consequences. First, the philosophical depth of non-duality is replaced with emotional sentiment. Second, the core insight into the illusory nature of self is lost. And third, the idea becomes non-falsifiable. If you feel good, you claim to be non-dual. If you feel bad, you just haven't aligned yet. Worse still, this misunderstanding can slide into a form of moral or existential relativism. There's no real good or bad. It's all one, which is not what Advaita or Zen teaches. Non-duality may reject absolute distinctions, but it doesn't deny consequence, responsibility, or the subtle structure of interdependence. In fact, in most traditions where non-duality is central, ethics are not discarded, they are reframed. Compassion, humility, and restraint arise not from commandments, but from the recognition that harming others is, in some deep way, harming a part of yourself, because the boundaries are not real in the way we thought. And so, the consequence of misunderstanding non-duality is not just conceptual, it's practical. When treated as a mystical idea, it becomes another symbol for the ego to wear. When approached as a philosophy, it becomes a tool to dismantle the illusion of separateness, freeing us from the compulsive pressure to define, defend, and preserve a permanent self. In a culture where the self has become a brand, a performance, a productivity engine, non-duality offers no brand, no audience, and no reward. And that is precisely where its value lies, not in giving us a bigger story to live inside, but in revealing that we were never the story to begin with. If understood correctly, non-duality doesn't solve the identity crisis, it removes the need to have one. Next, we turn to another misunderstood idea, wu-wei, often described as going with the flow. But what if this principle isn't about ease at all, but about abandoning control in a culture obsessed with it? In Western discussions of Eastern thought, wu-wei is often translated as non-action or going with the flow. It's quoted in self-help blogs and leadership books as a way to relax, to stop overthinking, to trust the process. It's even used to encourage a kind of spiritual laziness. Do nothing, and everything gets done. But this interpretation flattens one of Taoism's most intricate and counterintuitive insights into a motivational catchphrase. In classical Taoist philosophy, wu-wei does not mean passivity. It does not mean withdrawal. It certainly does not mean detachment in the modern psychological sense. At its core, wu-wei refers to a state of attunement, an action that arises without forced effort because it is aligned with the deeper unfolding of things. It's not doing nothing, but rather doing the right thing without friction. It is the opposite of artificial, ego-driven interference. It is the activity of a mind that no longer needs to control what it cannot truly grasp. The Western mind, steeped in instrumental rationality and goal-oriented behavior, often assumes that all value lies in effort, strategy, and measurable outcomes. Action is praised most when it is difficult. Willpower is celebrated even when it's corrosive. Busyness is seen as proof of virtue. So when Western interpreters encounter Wu-Wei, the natural impulse is to soften it, to make it digestible. But Wu-Wei is not a strategy for better outcomes. It's a reorientation of what we mean by doing at all. It challenges the premise that your effort is always beneficial. It asks, what if effort, when misaligned with the larger pattern of things, creates more resistance than result? This is not mysticism, it's observation. In nature, rivers do not force their way to the sea, they follow the terrain. The tree bends with the wind, not because it's weak, but because it has no need to resist what is already happening. The sage does not force order. He responds to what is, not to what the ego wishes. The misunderstanding of Wu-Wei creates several consequences. First, it becomes a license for apathy or disengagement. People invoke Wu-Wei to justify giving up, opting out, avoiding responsibility. But traditional Taoist texts never endorse withdrawal for its own sake. They advocate for a kind of responsive presence, the kind that knows when action is needed and when interference is harm disguised as help. Second, Wu-Wei becomes another tool for ego preservation. The modern Western individual, overloaded by productivity culture, hears Wu-Wei and says, this will help me stress less, work smarter, and still get what I want. But that's precisely the kind of egoic calculus Wu-Wei is meant to dissolve. True Wu-Wei doesn't serve the ego's goals more efficiently. It questions whether those goals ever belong to you at all. It is about acting without the psychological strain of, I must make this happen. It's not that outcomes don't matter, but that clinging to them distorts your ability to act in ways that are natural, adaptive, or intelligent. Third, the loss of Wu-Wei leads to the pathology of overreach. In many modern cultures, especially in Western models of leadership, innovation, or personal development, there is a deeply ingrained fear of surrender. To let go is to fail. To pause is to fall behind. To wait is to be dominated. But when you're constantly imposing your will onto the world, you're not solving problems, you're generating new forms of friction. Wu-Wei is not about abandoning responsibility. It's about recognizing that control is not the same as influence, and that the deepest forms of influence often emerge when you are no longer the center of your own calculations. In the Taoist texts, the sage is not inactive. He is transparent to the movement of the Tao. He acts without excess, without compulsion, and most of all, without self-importance. That is what Wu-Wei really means, to act from a place where the ego no longer clings to the illusion that it must push everything into place. In a culture built on exertion, strategy, and dominance, this idea is not just counterintuitive, it is a kind of heresy, but perhaps that's why it matters. The next concept is one that sounds harmless, but has quietly distorted the very ideas it claims to translate. Let's look at Gei, the act of mapping foreign ideas onto familiar ones, and what gets lost in the process. When ideas move across cultures, they rarely arrive intact. They pass through filters: language, symbolism, worldview. And in the process, something subtle often happens. What begins as philosophy becomes metaphor. What begins as disruption becomes decoration. The story of Gei is an early and revealing example. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, as Buddhism entered China from India, translators were confronted with a difficult problem. How do you explain unfamiliar philosophical concepts to an audience steeped in entirely different traditions? The solution they used was called Gei, literally matching concepts. Buddhist terms were explained using existing Taoist and Confucian ideas, so Dharma might be linked to Tao. Bodhi might be equated with Jin Ren, true person. Nirvana was sometimes framed in terms of Wu-Wei, non-action. This method helped ideas spread, but it came at a cost. These weren't accurate translations, they were approximations, and often they introduced philosophical mismatches that quietly reshaped the tradition itself. Over time, core Buddhist teachings about suffering, non-self, and cessation were gradually absorbed into Taoist metaphysics and Chinese cosmology. Buddhism survived in name, but its deeper logic began to shift. But Gei didn't stop in ancient China. It happens today too. Modern Western culture continues to match unfamiliar ideas with familiar language, whether through casual self-help interpretations or academic analysis. The framework is the same. fit the foreign idea into a shape we already understand. This is how meditation becomes stress relief, karma becomes reward and punishment, detachment becomes indifference, ego dissolution becomes a clever rebrand for self-development. None of these are entirely wrong, but none are quite right either. And in that inexact space, the intention of the original philosophy is lost. Why does this happen? Because interpretation is never neutral. When we encounter a new worldview, we instinctively reach for analogies, things we already know. This makes unfamiliar ideas feel safer, but it also reshapes them to reflect our own assumptions. In this case, many Eastern philosophies are interpreted through a Western lens of individualism, progress, and utility. Instead of asking, "What is this teaching trying to undo in me?" we ask, "How can this teaching improve me?" But not all philosophies are offering improvement. Some are offering liberation from the very self that seeks it. And when that's mistranslated, the result isn't harmless. It's misleading. There are real consequences to conceptual distortion. When ideas are mistranslated into comfort, their disruptive power is defanged. A concept like nirvana, originally referring to the extinguishing of craving and ego, becomes confused with bliss or serenity. A teaching like non-attachment becomes a technique for emotional control rather than existential freedom. Even compassion in Buddhist ethics becomes misinterpreted as niceness, when in fact it emerges from a precise understanding of interdependence, not sentiment. These aren't small errors, they're shifts in philosophical architecture. What Gei reveals is that translation is never just about words, it's about worldviews, and sometimes those worldviews are incompatible. You cannot easily map a relational ontology onto a culture built on atomized selfhood. You cannot easily carry teachings designed to dissolve the ego into a culture obsessed with cultivating it. Yet we try, and when we do, the risk is that we take the finger pointing at the moon and mistake it for the moon itself. We keep the language of awakening and discard the worldview that makes it meaningful. The lesson of Gei isn't to abandon interpretation. It's to approach it carefully, philosophically, to recognize that some concepts can't be matched without being mangled, that sometimes we must step outside our framework, not force others to fit inside it. Without this caution, even the most profound ideas become mirrors, reflecting only what we already believe. Next, we explore a concept even more abstract and even more misunderstood. It's often translated simply as emptiness. But sunyata is not nothingness, and it may hold the most radical insight about self and reality ever proposed. Few concepts have been more misunderstood across cultures than sunyata, a foundational insight in Mahayana Buddhism, often translated into English as emptiness. At first glance, the term itself sounds bleak. In English, empty suggests lack, loss, or void. It implies that something is missing, or worse, that nothing is there at all. But in its original philosophical context, sunyata doesn't mean absence, it means interdependence. It refers not to non-existence, but to the absence of independent, unchanging essence in any thing, idea, or identity. Everything that exists because of its conditions. Nothing stands alone. Nothing has an inherent, permanent core. To understand sunyata is to see that all things, objects, thoughts, emotions, even the self, are empty of fixed identity. They arise through causes, they change through conditions, and they pass away through relationships. This is not metaphysical speculation. It is a mode of perception, one that reveals how much of our suffering comes from trying to treat fluid, relational processes as solid and personal. We say, "I am anxious," but is anxiety a solid thing? We say, "I am this kind of person," but what part of us never changes? We say, "I need to control this outcome," but who exactly is the controller? The insight of sunyata is that these fixed references are illusions. Convenient, yes, but ultimately misleading. So how did such a precise philosophical insight become so widely misunderstood? In part, the problem lies in the translation itself. When sunyata was rendered as emptiness in English, the word carried cultural and emotional weight that didn't exist in the original Sanskrit. To Western ears, emptiness evokes absence, nihilism, even despair. But in Buddhist philosophy, sunyata is not a negation of reality. It is a description of reality's nature. It tells us things exist, not as isolated entities, but as networks of conditions. You are not less real because you are empty. You are real because you are empty. The cup holds water because it is empty. The sky holds light because it is open. And you can change, grow, evolve because you are not fixed. But in Western adaptations, sunyata has sometimes been reduced to a mood, a kind of cold detachment, or psychological disassociation. In others, it's treated as a mystical void, something esoteric, ineffable, unreachable. And in many cases, it's misunderstood as nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, nothing is real, and nothing exists. But that's a misreading. Buddhist thinkers from Nagarjuna to Tsongkhapa go to great lengths to distinguish sunyata from nihilism. The point is not that things don't exist. The point is that they don't exist in the way we assume they do. The consequences of this misunderstanding are significant. When sunyata is mistaken for nothingness, its ethical dimension is lost. In Buddhist practice, the realization of emptiness is not meant to produce apathy. It's meant to create compassion. If all things are interdependent, then harm is not isolated. Suffering is shared. There is no self-interest that is not also other interest. Emptiness reveals not coldness, but connection. When we no longer cling to fixed identities, mind versus yours, self versus world, we become more capable of ethical responsiveness, not out of duty, but out of clarity. To see sunyata clearly is not to lose meaning. It is to see that meaning arises through relationship, through movement, through change. The self you were yesterday is not the self you are now, and the freedom in that isn't despair, it's possibility. Emptiness is not an absence of value, it is the space in which value can arise without distortion. If we fail to grasp this, the idea becomes either paralyzing or ornamental, a spiritual aesthetic, a philosophical costume. But if we engage with it fully, sunyata offers something very different from what the ego wants. It offers the truth, that you were never a thing to begin with. You were always a process, always a relationship, always open. And in that openness, something like freedom becomes possible. And now we arrive at the final mystery, perhaps the most commonly referenced, yet least understood: karma. Not as reward or punishment, but as pattern, as a web of consequences in which no single you is standing at the center. In the modern West, karma has become a shorthand for cosmic bookkeeping. If something bad happens to someone, we say, that's karma. If we act generously, we expect good karma to return to us, as though the universe were a moral accountant balancing a moral bank account. It's an appealing picture, simple, symmetrical, and comforting, but it has little to do with the concept as it's understood in the philosophical traditions from which it comes. In its earliest formulations, both in Indian philosophy and in Buddhism, karma simply means action. More precisely, it means intentional action, mental, verbal, or physical, that sets in motion a chain of causes and effects. There is no cosmic judge, no supernatural courtroom, and no guarantee that effects will match causes in ways we'd call just. The law of karma is not a law of morality, it's a law of causation. You are not punished for your actions, you are punished or rewarded by them. In Buddhist thought, karma operates in a web of interdependent conditions, what's called pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination. Your choices ripple outward, combining with countless other forces, environmental, social, historical, to produce results that no one, not even you, fully controls. And because there's no fixed self at the center, anadman, there's no enduring owner of karma in the Western sense. What carries forward are patterns, momentum. The you that begins an action is not identical to the you that experiences its effects. So why has this been misunderstood? Partly because moral cause and effect is deeply ingrained in Western thought. From religious teachings to legal systems, we're taught to expect balance. Wrongdoing leads to punishment, virtue to reward. When karma entered Western vocabulary, it was quickly matched, much like in gai, to this familiar structure. It became a spiritualized version of what goes around comes around. The problem is, this framing turns karma into a transactional morality, something to manage for personal benefit. And that is exactly the kind of self-centered motivation the original teaching was meant to undermine. The consequences of this distortion are subtle but serious. When karma is understood as cosmic reward, ethical action becomes conditional. We act well, not because it is inseparable from wisdom, but because we expect something in return. When karma is seen as divine punishment, suffering becomes blame. We look at misfortune and assume the sufferer must have deserved it. Both attitudes reinforce ego, separateness, and moral complacency. The philosophical view is far less sentimental and far more demanding. Karma means that every action, no matter how small, participates in a network of consequences. Your behavior is not isolated. It alters the conditions in which other beings live, think, and act. There is no point at which you can say, "This is mine alone," and there is no safe place to stand outside the web. This perspective makes morality less about obeying rules and more about recognizing entanglement. You are not an actor on the stage of the world. You are a node in its fabric. Every thread you move pulls on another. Seeing this way, karma is not a comfort. It's a responsibility. It refuses the fantasy that we can live for ourselves alone. It dissolves the idea that we can control the outcomes of our actions, while still holding us accountable for the choices we make. Karma is not a promise that good will triumph in every instance. It is a reminder that nothing you do disappears. It becomes part of the conditions that shape what happens next, for you, for others, and for the world that contains you both. If we adopt this view, karma stops being a spiritual ledger and becomes something far more sobering, a recognition that every thought, every word, every movement, however private or trivial it seems, changes the field in which all lives are unfolding. And in that sense, karma is not about balance, it's about connection. It's about seeing that every choice you make, every word, every silence, every gesture threads itself into a larger fabric that no single person owns. That awareness can be heavy, yes, but it can also be clarifying. It shows us that meaning doesn't come from control, it comes from participation. And maybe that's the thread that runs through all 5 of these so-called mysteries: non-duality, wu-wei, gui, sunyata, and karma. Each one undermines the illusion of a separate, fixed self. Each one replaces it with the unsettling and liberating truth that we are entangled. But that truth isn't something you can just take my word for. It's something that unfolds only when tested in real life, when you notice how you react to change, how you respond to others, how you interpret your own story. So, I'll leave it to you. Which of these ideas resonates with your own experience? Where have you seen them misunderstood or misused? And if these concepts were understood in their original spirit, how might they change the way we live together? Because in the end, the question isn't whether we can describe these ideas perfectly. It's whether they move us to live differently tomorrow than we did today.